Patard! Oh my god! Patard! Patard! What's wrong? Get rid of it!
I hear footprints. Hear that? I can hear them walking around the van.
Starting off our list today with a story submitted to Reddit by user MaliaGirl1314 titled, "My wife is peeking at me." And honestly, this thing is pure nightmare fuel. It's long, so here's the cliff notes. Listen at your own risk. The story was written by a man about his wife Lynn, who he had been married to for 6 years and 11 months with no issues, until one day he caught her peeking. Just peeking at him from behind the wall. He thought it was strange because she wasn't one for pranks or games, but when he caught her, she ran away giggling like a schoolgirl. He was weirded out, but he shook it off until about 3 days later. He went downstairs in the middle of the night for a drink of water and looked down at the floor to see his wife staring at him with wide eyes and a plastered on smile before scurrying away on all fours. Weeks later, while in the shower, he opened his eyes to see her head stretched into the shower, eyes red and unblinking, with the same creepy smile plastered across her face. He screamed and she ran, slamming the bathroom door behind her. Or so he thought, because when he stepped out of the shower, he got that same sinking feeling that he was being watched. He looked up to see his wife peering at him from the top of the closet door in the bathroom. He fled to his brothers, who a few nights later convinced him to return home and face his wife. The two went back to the house only to be met with a horrible stench and shattered glass strewn across the stairs. Lynn was nowhere to be found, and so the husband began packing up a bag. But when he opened the closet, he saw pairs of real eyeballs lined up along the closet floor. And then all of a sudden, there it was again, the sinking feeling that he and his brother were being watched. He peered under the bed to see his wife staring back at him, her hands stained red clasped together under her chin in excitement. She tried to attack him and his brother, but thankfully they managed to escape. They called the police, but she was never captured. The husband then went to stay in a motel, which is where he wrote the story, but it ends with him saying that all of a sudden he began to get that eerie feeling once more. And then a text popped up on his phone. Just 3 words and a photograph. "I found you," and his wife's unblinking, smile-plastered face. Already covered in goosebumps. This next one was posted to Reddit by user Grey Bread, and it is called "I Know You're Awake." The story goes that one night, a young man was asleep in bed when all of a sudden he hears footsteps outside of his door. He holds the covers up and opens his eyes ever so slightly to see a large man stepping into his room, holding the dead bodies of both of the young man's parents. The large man then props the mother and father's lifeless bodies up in some chairs located at the corner of the room, and then takes the red seeping from their wounds and writes something on the wall before crawling underneath the young man's bed. It's dark, and so the young man can't quite make out what the message reads. He pretends to be asleep until his eyes adjust to the light, and he can finally read what the large man wrote on the wall. He gasps when he finally makes out the words, "I know you're awake." He then hears movement coming from underneath the bed.
And we're starting off with the abandoned amusement park. It kind of wasn't even abandoned, to be honest. It was set to open just days after the disaster, so it was never actually used. The rusted Ferris wheel and desolate bumper cars still stand though. It's definitely eerie, but somber too, an area frozen in time, a reminder of what could have been. The park, meant to be a source of entertainment for the residents of Pripyat and the workers of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, now stands as a testament to the sudden and irreversible changes brought about by the events of that fateful day. The centerpiece of the park is the rusted Ferris wheel, which was meant to offer a nice panoramic view of the city, and surrounding it are the remains of bumper cars, a once colorful carousel, and the other amusement rides, all now deteriorating and covered in a layer of rust. And instead of the screams of happy visitors, There's just an eerie silence. Empty benches and picnic tables where families were meant to gather, completely desolate. Nature slowly reclaiming its territory has overgrown pathways and cracked the pavement, creating this sad, kind of post-apocalyptic ambience. If you are enjoying our channel, by the way, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. We got videos coming at you on the daily. Number 9, the reactor control room. So deep within the bowels of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, the reactor 4 control room still stands, a relic frozen in time. This once bustling control center was the nerve center where decisions and actions were taken on that night in 1986. It's said that as you step into the room, the air is heavy. The dust-covered dials and cracked screens are a reminder of the frantic attempts to bring the situation under control. The red radiation warning lights, frozen at levels that spell out the magnitude of the disaster. In the dim light, you can almost imagine the hum of machinery, the hurried footsteps, the urgent conversations that once filled the room, a complete contrast to the lifeless, ghostly atmosphere that it has now. Pripyat Hospital. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out why the place is unsettling. Hospitals are depressing, even when fully open and operational. Abandoned hospitals are that. Plus, they have the creep factor of being empty and abandoned. So an abandoned hospital in the middle of a radioactive death zone, that's pretty much the apex of nightmarish hospitals right there. Looking at images of this place online, it looks like the real-life Silent Hill or something. Chipped paint, rusted beds, the building is literally falling apart and decaying. Really oozes with ambience, just not the kind of ambience you want to sit back and relax in. And at number 7, we have the Blackbird of Chernobyl. In the months preceding the catastrophic events of April 26, 1986, residents near the Chernobyl nuclear power plant reported encountering a grotesque creature, a mutated figure with gigantic wings and deep red eyes. Nightmares and direct confrontations with this winged anomaly, later dubbed the Blackbird of Chernobyl, haunted a number of residents of the area. And then there was the devastating explosion of Reactor 4 at 1:23 a.m. The ensuing fire and nuclear meltdown led to the evacuation of over 336,000 people, and the story goes that several survivors of this incident were counted witnessing a colossal blackbird with a 20-foot wingspan soaring through the sky. Even if you've never heard of this particular part of the Chernobyl lore, this story probably sounds kind of familiar. It's very similar to the Mothman sightings in West Virginia right before the Silver Bridge collapse in 1968. The physical description of the creature is similar, and the fact that these creatures were reported appearing right before disasters, both the Blackbird of Chernobyl and the Mothman vanished after each of these catastrophes. So you can't help but wonder if these ominous creatures are bound to disaster, omens that materialize in the shadows preceding total destruction. Next on the list is the notorious Red Forest. So the Red Forest, named for the eerie reddish color assumed by the pine trees following the radioactive fallout, is a symbol of the environmental impact of the Chernobyl disaster. This dense woodland located near the nuclear power plant absorbed a significant amount of radioactive particles, resulting in the death of its vibrant flora. As you step into the Red Forest, the silence is apparently palpable. The once lush trees, now lifeless and devoid of foliage, stand as a testament to the irreversible consequences of the nuclear fallout. Scientists did this really interesting experiment here too to see how messed up things really were. They filled bags with leaves from clean spots and left them in both normal and messed up areas. So surprise, surprise, leaves in the messed up spots didn't break down much, holding on to about 60% of their weight. This means the radiation messed with the nature's ability to decompose and replenish itself in the area. The leaves stayed dry and intact for almost a year. Sounds harmless, but dry leaves in a place that's prone to forest fires, it's a ticking time bomb. If a fire breaks out, it could spread radioactive stuff beyond the no-go zone. So not only is the radiation messing with the forest's ability to bounce back, but now there's a legit risk of radioactive fire, spreading trouble even farther.
Whether it's a strange World War II era disappearance that remains unsolved, multiple stories of time slips in the same English location, or a quantum thought experiment that is truly mind-melting. This list is full of the unexplained, the unusual, and the unsettling, so let's dive right in. Starting off this list today, we have the disappearance of the L8 Blimp Crew. The L8 Blimp incident remains one of the most baffling unsolved mysteries from World War II. The blimp was initially on a patrol mission to scout for enemy submarines along the California coast. As it returned, something very unforeseen occurred. Observers on the ground noticed the blimp's erratic behavior before its descent, yet no distress signals were sent from the crew. Upon investigation, all control systems within the blimp were found operational, and personal belongings of the crew were still on board, suggesting a very sudden and unexplained disappearance. What makes this case even more intriguing is that the blimp managed to navigate and land in a densely populated area without causing significant damage or injury, almost as if it were being controlled or guided by unseen hands. The absence of any struggle or attempt to communicate by the crew has fueled speculation about paranormal activities, including theories of abduction or unintentional travel to another dimension. Despite various investigations and inquiries, no conclusive explanation has been provided, leaving the fate of the crew a mystery and a source of speculation about the potential for anomalies or breaches in our understanding of space and time. Next up on our list today, we have the Liverpool time slips. So this is something I didn't know, but apparently there is a phenomenon of time slips in Liverpool, particularly around the area known as Bold Street. These experiences typically involve individuals or groups of people feeling as though they have momentarily stepped back in time, encountering surroundings, people, and objects that appear to be from a different era. In the case of a policeman named Frank, he described seeing cars, fashion, and shop fronts that were all distinctly from the 1960s, a very stark contrast to the 1990s environment that he had come from. Even more intriguingly, upon returning to the present, he could find no logical explanation for his experience, as everything in his surroundings had returned to normal. Such incidents raise questions about the nature of time and reality. Are these time slips just hallucinations, or do they offer a glimpse into a parallel universe or an alternate reality that momentarily overlaps with our own? While definitive scientific explanations remain elusive, these experiences continue to provoke curiosity, suggesting a world that is much more complex and mysterious than our conventional understanding may allow. Next up, we have the mystery of Gadianton Canyon. In 1972, the journey of 4 university women took an eerie turn when they opted for a shortcut through Gadianton Canyon, hoping to shorten their trip back to Southern Utah University from Nevada. As they ventured deep into the canyon, the familiar desert landscape transformed inexplicably into an alien terrain, marked by an unsettling quiet that blanketed the area. The road beneath them changed to gravel, and the surroundings became increasingly unfamiliar and very foreboding. The group encountered structures that defied conventional architecture, featuring angles and materials that seemed out of place and time. Most unsettling were the egg-shaped vehicles with elongated, opaque windows, unlike any cars or machinery known at the time, seemingly parked or abandoned. These elements contributed to a palpable sense of dislocation, and there was an overwhelming sense of dread. Despite the urge to explore or understand their bizarre surroundings, fear and survival instincts prevailed, prompting the girls to get out of there as fast as humanly possible. Miraculously, as they retraced their route, the surreal landscape gave way to the familiar high desert scenery of southern Utah, though no clear boundary marked the transition. Subsequent attempts to locate the strange road and its surroundings ended in vain, as no maps or local accounts could verify the existence of the places and objects they reported seeing. This very strange experience led the women and those who later heard their story to speculate that they might have inadvertently crossed into a parallel dimension, a brief glimpse into an alternate reality abruptly encountered and then left behind. Next up today we have the Vanishing Hotel. A French couple traveling in the 1970s decided to stay at a quaint, seemingly out-of-place hotel in the countryside. The hotel and its staff appeared to belong to an earlier time, and the couple noted peculiarities such as the absence of telephones or modern amenities. I feel like that's a really big red flag. I don't know. No telephones at a hotel? What is this, Norman Bates? Upon trying to find the hotel again on a subsequent trip, it was nowhere to be found, and no one in the area could recall its existence, suggesting a possible slip into a parallel world. At our halfway point today, we have the interdimensional ring. A person reported finding a very unique ring that did not belong to them in their home. Despite thorough investigations, they could not trace the ring's origins or how it came into their possession. You just know that somebody in that household was getting accused of cheating in that moment. The mysterious ring appeared to possess unusual characteristics and design unlike any common jewelry. Its style did not match any known era or culture, which only deepened the mystery surrounding it. As the person wore the ring, peculiar incidents began to unfold. Objects in their home seemed to move independently, and time appeared to distort, with hours passing in what felt like minutes. On several occasions, the wearer claimed to see fleeting glimpses of otherworldly landscapes or to hear whispers in an unrecognizable language. These experiences intensified the belief that the ring was not merely an object of unknown provenance, but a conduit to parallel dimensions, offering brief, disorienting peeks into these alternate realities that coexist with our own. Would you want a ring with that kind of power, or would you journey across the land to destroy it in a fiery pit? Next up we have the flight into the future. In the 1930s, a British pilot claimed to have flown into a cloud bank only to emerge in what seemed to be the future. He described seeing unfamiliar aircraft and an altered landscape, but upon returning to his own time, he reported the incident, but unfortunately there was just no evidence to substantiate his experience. This story has been interpreted by some as a possible encounter with a time slip or a parallel dimension, but to me it really is just giving Manifest. I don't know if you guys have seen that show, but it's crazy, and I feel like maybe that show was based on what happened here. I don't know. Next up today we have the quantum thought exercise, just simultaneously my favorite and least favorite on this entire list, because it stresses me out. While not an anecdote of an actual event, the quantum thought experiment is often associated with the idea of quantum immortality and is related to the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. Imagine a situation similar to the Schrodinger's cat experiment, where a physicist uses a potentially lethal mechanism that is triggered or not triggered based on a quantum event, like the decay of a radioactive atom. Okay, I know it sounds confusing. Stay with me, alright? In this thought experiment, every time the mechanism has a chance to be triggered, the universe would split, creating one reality where the physicist survives and another where they do not. However, the physicist, as an observer, would only ever experience the outcomes where they survive, hence the term quantum immortality. They would seemingly jump from one universe to another where they continue living, never experiencing their own death. The idea here is that, from the physicist's perspective, they might feel as though they are transitioning into different parallel universes where they continue to exist. It is a very mind-bending concept that suggests that our consciousness could persist in a multiverse, experiencing only those branches of reality where we survive. It's interesting, scary, unsettling. I don't know, that's just how I feel about this one.
What's more of a haunted highway than Highway 666, the Devil's Highway? Highway 666, the sixth branch of the famous Route 66. It really doesn't get more never drive at 3 a.m. than this. Today, the highway is known as Highway 191. The name was changed due to the belief that the many accidents, apparitions, and creepy mishaps mishaps were caused by the highway having adorned the devil's number for so long. Unfortunately, however, changing the name has not changed the nature of the road, which remains haunted, dangerous, and incredibly creepy to this day. Phantom trucks, ghostly passengers appearing in back seats, see-through hitchhikers in torn white gowns, and hellhounds ready to rip the rubber directly off of your tires are a common sight for those driving along the roadway at night. One woman recounted a drive she had taken along the highway with her husband, saying, "At first everything seemed normal. Her and her husband were the only ones on the road when all of a sudden a massive truck appeared out of nowhere that seemed as though it was headed straight for the pair, charging so fast towards them that sparks were flying from the wheels and flames were coming out of the smokestack. The pair pulled off the road and waited for the truck to pass, and when it did, it disappeared into the night." I'm gonna go ahead and say avoid this roadway at night if you and your tires, which like I said are subject to be ripped apart by literal hellhounds, want to make it to your destination in one piece.
There are plenty of haunted hotspots along Route 66, but one of the most famous is an abandoned truck stop in Villa Ridge, the Tri-County Truck Stop, which opened in 1971 and closed in 2006. Ever since its closing though, people have reported strange stuff going on at the site, and there have been plenty of paranormal investigations in the abandoned building. A team of paranormal investigators called the Paranormal Task Force investigated the site in 2006, and the guy leading the investigation, Greg Myers, said they experienced some pretty weird stuff. Almost as soon as they arrived, a coffee pot came flying off a shelf. It's a nice welcome. He also added, quote, "On the first night we were setting up a camera on the second floor. I was holding a door shut and something was trying to open it from the other side. We were actually fighting back and forth." Other investigators have spotted a man in red flannel in the bathroom vanishing as soon as he's spotted, and other objects like light bulbs being hurled. And people have also apparently seen orbs and spectral shapes floating through the building, some which have been caught on camera.
Dead Man's Curve, located in Claremont County in Ohio.
This first story comes from Reddit user Spartan Moo, and honestly, it's pretty freaky. Let's check it out. I have a million stories that are more grotesque and gory than this one, but it stands out to me. I was once working at a mortuary and I had to go pick up a man from the medical examiner's office. When you do that, at least where I'm from, you get a receipt when they release the body to you. The receipt has all of the personal belongings that are with the deceased. When I brought the man back to the office, I opened up the body bag to make sure that all the belongings were there and double checked the receipt. But when I opened up the bag, I was stunned to find this dude looked almost exactly like me. He was my age, had similar tattoos in similar spots, and had the same long hair I do, even the same style of jewelry I was wearing. It took me so off guard that I stood there in an existential crisis until the embalmer came in and was like, "Hey Spartan Moo, how's it going? Oh my god, that guy looks just like you." It's the only case I've ever had nightmares about, during which nightmares I'll be the one in the body bag with the deceased man opening me up. I don't blame you for having nightmares. That is the true definition of nightmare fuel.
From Reddit user The Mapes Hotel comes a story we're going to call The Worms. I interned at a funeral home crematorium in high school. I was goth. It was the perfect street cred internship. The funeral home owner was a nice guy, Phil, with a PH, and he always introduced himself that way. He had a family and was married, great sense of humor, bright personality, almost bubbly. About 8 to 9 months after my internship ended, Phil was forced to stop working. He'd begun, according to him, finding worms inside people. Long, white, wriggling worms. Thousands of them filling people's bodies. He'd called the CDC, local doctors, hospitals, other funeral homes on the West Coast. No one else had found the worms, but he began to find them inside every person he worked on. He talked non-stop about the worms, first to his family, then to the families of clients, then to strangers. He had a total breakdown after autopsying a boy who was almost entirely worms, again, according to PH. After the breakdown, Phil was pushed out of his business and it was sold to a national chain. About 6 months after being forced out, Phil took his own life. While I never read the note itself, his wife later told me that he'd written about being able to feel the worms inside himself and not being able to stand it. He'd begged his wife in the note to follow him and to also kill their offspring, as when he looked at his sons, all he could see were the worms inside them.
This first story comes from Reddit user Glitch in the Matrix, and it's pretty long, so I'm gonna have to paraphrase. The user starts off by setting the scene. They are around 18 or 19 years old, living in their childhood home. One day, they decide to go for a walk to a nearby park, which they had been doing since they were young. It was around 1 or 2 p.m. They stepped out of the front door, and all of a sudden, things just felt wrong. Everything felt different. It didn't look different, but it felt different and completely wrong. They decided to shake it off and continued their walk down to the park when they locked eyes with their neighbor, whose face went completely pale as though he had seen a ghost. Just as the neighbor was about to speak, user Glitch in the Matrix found themselves back in their house, standing at the front door, ready to leave for their walk. They stood there for a few moments in complete disbelief, but at the same time relieved, because things didn't feel different or wrong anymore. They looked down the street and the neighbor was nowhere to be found. Regardless, they decided to skip the walk for that day. The entire experience, the teleportation, and the incredibly off feeling of the neighborhood had left the user quite uneasy, even now, so many years later. Not only that, it has left them wondering if somehow momentarily they slipped into some kind of alternate reality, only to be brought back to where they truly belong just moments later. Spooky.
In March of 2006, Carol Chase McKinley was driving with her dog from San Bernardino to Paris, California. She decided to make a pit stop in Riverside, where she grew up. She had grandparents buried in a local cemetery and remembered her own time living there. Once she got there, she was shocked to find that familiar places, including her family's old homes and the cemetery, were completely unrecognizable. The cemetery was overgrown and unkempt, and the houses she remembered had been replaced by newer buildings. Even Riverside City College and Central Middle School, which she recognized, seemed oddly out of place compared to her memories. Her old neighborhood, which had once featured her grandmother's large Tudor home and her aunt's house, was now a rundown area with modern bungalows and graffiti. The banks, insurance companies, and restaurants she remembered were gone. She felt so unsettled by the changes and the ominous atmosphere that she was afraid to even stop and ask for directions. Eventually, she returned to Paris where everything was normal. But here's the strange thing. When she went back to Riverside a few years later for her father's funeral, everything had reverted back to how she remembered it from her childhood. Her family's homes were as they had been. Everything felt right again. Now your first thought is like, well, alright, she just took a wrong turn and wasn't actually in her hometown before. But as I said, certain landmarks had been correct. Like the college and the middle school. The cemetery was also in the same spot. It was just run down. It was as if she'd driven into some strange upside down version of her childhood town.
Alright, this next story comes from Reddit user Deathstar_57, and it was actually posted to the unofficial Most Amazing Top 10 Reddit page, which we do not run, but it does have some pretty interesting stories and some pretty creepy ones too. My advice: don't read them before bed. Anyways, the story goes as follows. I got up and found my pet dead on the ground, so I buried him outside my house. But when I woke up the next morning, my pet was still dead on the ground. So I went to the spot it was first buried, and its body was still there. A few months later, I slipped off my bike and hit my head, and I was in a coma. I remember feeling movement, but I couldn't open my eyes. When I woke up, I was taken home, and after a few days, I found my dog alive outside of my yard. Now, while this entire thing could have very well likely been a coma dream, it's also entirely possible that while unconscious, this guy slipped into 1 or even 2 alternate realities in which his beloved pet didn't make it. But I'm glad that in this reality at least, Deathstar57's dog is alive and well.
In 2008, a woman named Lorena Garcia posted on an internet forum about all these strange things that had suddenly changed in her life, as if she'd suddenly shifted into another reality. The story got a decent amount of buzz at the time. According to Garcia, who was 41 at the time, she'd woken up on what seemed like an average morning, but surprise, she'd switched realities. For starters, her pajamas and bed sheets were different than they were when she went to bed. This was odd, but nothing to panic about, so she headed off to work. When she got there though, it became clear that something was definitely off. When she got to her floor, she quickly realized she was in the wrong department, even though she'd gone to the exact location and floor she'd been going to for 20 years. She went back home only to find that her new boyfriend wasn't there either. Instead, it was the dude she'd broken up with 6 months before. She asked him what the hell he was doing in her house, and he looked at her like she was crazy. She tried calling her new boyfriend, nothing. Tried going to his house, someone else was living there. She even went as far as to hire a private detective to find him, but nothing ever turned up. So did Lorena Garcia just have a really detailed, vivid dream about some other man that never really existed, or did she happen to take a fateful fall into the Twilight Zone?
In 1947, in Tokyo's Haneda Airport, a man named John Zergus handed his passport over to the gate agent. Only thing was, his passport had been issued in a country, Torid, that as far as we know, doesn't exist. The gate agent looked at the man, who was well dressed and calm and appeared completely normal, save his incredibly strange identification document, and questioned him about the legitimacy of the passport. John then became irritated, insisting that Torid did in fact exist and that it was located between Spain and France. The more they questioned him, the more frustrated he became, and he even pulled out his driver's license and bank statements, all of which had been issued in this unknown Torid place. Eventually, police stepped in, and John Zergus was taken to a hotel to be held overnight until he could be properly investigated the following morning. The hotel room John stayed in was on a high floor with no balcony, and it was guarded the entire duration of his stay, which is why officials were so incredibly baffled when they opened the door to his bedroom the next morning to find absolutely no sign of John or any of his belongings. No one could figure out how or where he'd gone. While this might sound like some kind of urban legend or old wives' tale, the case of John Zergus, who was detained in Japan for identity fraud, is a documented case in Japanese history. Whether or not the whole Torid thing is true is up for debate, but if it is true, it certainly points to a significant glitch in reality where John was momentarily detained in our version of reality before returning, hopefully safely, to his own.
This next story is absolutely wild. Not only do we have people ending up in a place they don't recognize, seemingly out of nowhere, but you have strange futuristic vehicles, a police investigation, and the case is from 1972, long before the internet and the popularity of all these reality shifting stories on internet forums. In May of 1972, 4 girls were driving back to Southern Utah University after spending a Saturday at a rodeo. At around 10 p.m. they crossed into the Utah-Nevada state line and took a turn into Gadianton Canyon. Strangely, as they drove, the road began to change from black pavement to white cement. Thinking they were lost, they turned around but found themselves driving past unfamiliar grain fields and ponderosa pines instead of the desert that they'd been expecting. They stopped at a roadside tavern to ask for directions, but suddenly one of the girls started screaming. What they claimed to have seen were 4 egg-shaped vehicles with tricycle wheels and bright lights chasing them. Terrified, they hopped back into the car and sped through the canyon, and soon the road returned to the familiar black asphalt. They ended up crashing into a creek, which left them with 3 flat tires. They waited until morning and then hiked to Highway 56, where they flagged down a state trooper named Victoria Lindquist. The trooper took their report, and some details about the situation were pretty odd. The tire tracks the girls left stopped abruptly about 600 feet into the desert, which was strange considering they were found 2 miles away from the highway with no clear evidence of how they got there. And despite a thorough search, there was a missing right front hubcap of their Chevy that was never found.
Sto Moon, the legend of the red and white-haired woman who lived aboard the hollow ship, is an incredibly old Japanese tale that tells of a futuristic ship made of metal and wood, equipped with crystal windows that one day made its way into the shores of Hitachi, a province in Japan. From the ship emerged an incredibly futuristic-looking woman with bright red hair with long white strands at the bottom and pale grayish skin. She appeared shocked to have ended up in the area and was downright terrified of the locals. She didn't speak any known languages, and she refused to let go of a small box she held tightly to her chest throughout the entire ordeal. Authorities entered her ship to find nothing more than 2 sheets, a small supply of water, and some strange food that resembled some kind of pastry made of meat and bread. Eventually, the woman was allowed back on the ship and sent on her way. Where she came from, or where she went, no one really knows. Perhaps she traveled to Japan from the future, or maybe even an alternate reality. And while I respect the locals' respect respecting the woman's privacy at the time, I am curious as to what they would have found had they looked in the box she had been holding onto so tightly. Since the incident, many people have claimed to have seen the woman from another world, but we are yet to learn her true origin, what was in the box, and why on earth she was so scared.
In 1975, a man named Daniel Brinkley was struck by lightning while answering the phone. He was declared dead for 28 minutes before being revived. During those minutes, Brinkley claimed to experience what he described as leaving his body, finding himself in a dark, terrifying realm. He was then rescued by spiritual beings who took him through a tunnel of light. He claims he met beings of light who showed him his life's events in a kind of life review, seeing every moment of his life and how his actions had affected others, kind of like a more modern version of A Christmas Carol. The experience changed him profoundly, and he came back with this mission to share his story and the lessons he learned about life after death. He wrote a book about the experience that was successful enough to spawn a couple sequels and a movie in 1995.
The story of William Cantello and Hiram Maxim is either a case of a man on the run or some kind of alternate reality Freaky Friday. You see, back in the 1800s, there was a man named William Cantello. He was an eccentric inventor who had dedicated a great amount of his time developing an automatic rapid-firing weapon. When he finally completed his invention, Cantello informed his son that he was heading down to the market to sell it. Only problem is, Cantello never returned. Even stranger, no more than 20 years later, a man named Hiram Maxim appeared on the scene. Maxim had invented an automatic rapid-firing weapon, and he looked almost identical to Cantello, so much so that Cantello's children actually mistook Maxim for their father. Maxim became so distraught with constantly being compared to Cantello that he later wrote about the experience in his autobiography, claiming that there was a man impersonating him. While that might be true, or perhaps Maxim really was Cantello and had simply wanted to get away from his family or out of some debt, there is another theory out there that Cantello and Maxim are essentially the same people but from different realities, and one day they switched, causing both to spend the rest of their days often mistaken for one another and incredibly confused and irritated.
This final story comes to us from a now deleted Reddit user that goes as follows. I had something really odd happen to me last Friday, and I'm wondering if anyone else has experienced something similar. I was running errands in my town, a place I know well. Around 3 p.m. I went to a coffee shop I frequent. When I walked in, I noticed that the decor was completely different, and the staff seemed unfamiliar. The menu had changed too, with items I've never seen before. I thought maybe I was in the wrong place, but the sign outside said it was definitely the same shop. I left feeling confused and decided to drive to a nearby park. When I got there, it was totally different. New playground equipment, a different layout, and even a new entrance. After about 2 hours of wandering around, everything suddenly felt familiar again. The coffee shop was back to normal, and the park was as I remembered. I haven't been able to find any explanation for this. Could I have briefly shifted into a different reality, or is there a more logical explanation? They later went on to make a brief update on the post, by the way, stating that they'd checked with the coffee shop and park management, and that apparently no changes had been made.
This next story comes from Reddit user Goin' Crazy, and it goes as follows. My aunt was a cemetery worker and told me an absolute cracker that happened to her. There was an old chap who would come every Monday at the same time and put roses on his wife's grave. He was a well-known regular visitor and would always stop and chat with the workers. Anyway, she was working on this fine Monday and she saw this chap at his wife's grave like usual. He'd just changed out the roses and she went over to ask if he'd like to give the old ones to her to dispose of. What followed was a normal 20-minute chat talking about all kinds of things. But then he had to go, so she waved him off and he left. The next day when she turned up for work, there was a new work order for the morning, so she went out to find the plot. Turns out it was right next to the chap's wife. Frowning, she checked the work order again and saw that it was the old roses guy. She dug the grave, got it prettied up for the service, and later that morning the funeral home turned up to inter him. She went up to the funeral guy in charge and asked why the rush to bury the old chap. Mortuary worker said, "What do you mean, why the rush?" Aunt, "Well, he was here yesterday putting roses on his wife's grave. What happened to him?" Mortuary worker, He died on Thursday, last week." Aunt, "No, he was here yesterday. points at fresh roses on his wife's grave. Mortuary worker looking at the flowers. Are you sure it was him? Aunt, yeah, we had a chat like we always do. He was talking about his daughter's new kid. Mortuary worker, wow. Seems like a pretty classic case of a ghost sighting. Kind of sweet, more so than freaky though. I don't know, I like this one.
This next Redditor used to work in a morgue in Florida. They shared a few short stories in their response to a thread about some of the creepiest and most uncomfortable things morgue or funeral home workers ever experienced. Writing, uncomfortable? Being trapped in the morgue alone during a hurricane. Our morgue was basically in a basement type situation and the hospital was near a main waterway that flooded. I had to move all the bodies to the highest cabinets, pray the generators would keep everyone cold, and was standing on my desk for about 2 hours when someone finally came for me. Bizarre would be a drowned guy who is dead on arrival, and once locked up in the cabinet, a tapping noise started coming from him. It was a crab that had made itself at home inside him, and when it got cold, he wanted out. Creepy was when we got some people who were doing bath salts and had eaten other people. They looked crazy even in death. This Redditor never even said they were from Florida. A commenter just pieced it together based on the stories, and he was like, yep, Florida. It's wild over there.
This next story comes from Reddit user Ash9260, and it goes like this. I work at a hospital in the lab, and one day I was dropping off a bunch of limbs to the morgue after hours. We put them in the freezer with the bodies. I went in to put the legs and arms in the back. The freezer door was closed, but it doesn't lock. For some reason though, when I went to leave, I couldn't get the door open. I was stuck. And the morgue is in a weird spot of the hospital. It takes like 3 rooms to get to it, and it's a very big freezer, and no one can hear you scream from the inside. Anyways, I was screaming nonetheless, like as loud as I could, trying to get out. And the freezer was so packed that I accidentally hit a dead body in my panic. I dig it out a few minutes later. The part that is so strange though was my patient I had for 4 months died that day and was in the morgue when this happened. We talked a lot, and I told him at one point how scared I was of getting locked in the morgue. He had asked about the morgue because he knew he was dying and was curious. Anyways, I'd like to think that it was him playing a prank on me. That story's like 30% cute and like 70% quit your job and never go anywhere near another mortuary ever again terrifying. I'm just saying. It's a no from me.
From Cylons in a police box comes a story I'm going to call the Moaning. This comes from my mother, back when she was younger. A guy she knows takes a job at the local funeral home. He works the graveyard shift, all was well for the first few months, but dude is often weirded out at work, claims the building is haunted. Earlier in the evening, they get a call from the hospital saying that they have a lady there ready for pickup. They pick her up. Guy is freaking out, says he has a bad feeling. Later in the evening, the mortician has to step out for a bit, leaving the guy there alone with the dead lady. He goes about his work, still a little freaked out. Suddenly, he hears this low, soft moan. He swears it's just his mind playing tricks on him, goes about his business, hears it again, a little louder this time. It's late, he's alone, he's just hearing things, probably just the pipes settling. The plumbing is old, after all. Short time passes, and it's louder. At this point, he's sure he isn't just imagining things. He knows he heard the dead lady moan. His first thought was the mortician was messing with him. He's been shaken all evening, and this a-hole is pranking him. He marches over, yanks back the sheet covering the dead lady, expecting to find the mortician somewhere around her. Dead lady grabs the guy's wrist. He lets out this scream and bolts for the door, forgets his car, just runs all the way home. Turns out the old lady wasn't dead. Hospital got it wrong. Hooray 1950s medicine. She'd been in a coma or something, and they'd been sure she'd passed on earlier that morning. She woke up at the funeral home and scared the ever-living hell out of the assistant. He quit the next day, said he would never set foot there ever again. And fair enough.
This next story comes from Reddit user Missy Maypen, and it's both horrifying and, like the last one, kind of miraculous. It goes like this. When my cousin was 18, he was in a bad car wreck, and he, his girlfriend, and her sister were all pronounced dead at the scene. The police arrived to inform my aunt, his mom, and she asked that he be sent to a very specific funeral home. While the funeral director was preparing to embalm him, he sat up on the table and asked, "Where the hell am I?" The funeral director said it was the first time he ever had to go home and change his pants. I should add that at the time my brother asked that question, the top of his head was open and his brain was exposed. He was sent to the hospital, and the same police officer who told my aunt he had died told her that he was in fact not dead and was now in the hospital. They thought he'd be in a vegetative state for the rest of his life, but a few weeks later he walked out of the hospital. He has horrible headaches on occasion, but he's led a successful life and he's a great guy. Talk about a plot twist.
Alright, this one's not as miraculous. Put your food down for this one. The imagery I got in my head reading this, anyway, thought I'd share. This one comes to us from Reddit user Kuda Ravage. Lady I work with used to pick up the bodies for the coroner. One time they had to collect a woman that was lying in a very hot attic apartment for a couple months. All her liquids ran out onto the floor and dried. When they tried to pick her up, she started coming apart like an overly tender turkey. Her coworker sent her to the van to get more bags. When she got back, he'd finished bagging the lady. Classy. Changed how I think about turkey.
Alright, this next one comes from yet another Reddit user. This time it's the Eth Henry. It's both scary and funny, and it goes like this. My neighbor, a while back before I moved in, was a mortician. He didn't have any creepy stories per se, but one that sticks out concerns this one night he had a body he was preparing for a very early morning wake or service, whatever was going on. It was unusual, and so it required him to work to the wee hours of the morning on this particular corpse. So as he's working on it, he turned his back to grab some tools or supplies, and the angle he was standing at with regard to the corpse left the body visible just out of the corner of his eye. As he was looking down at whatever tools he was getting, in the corner of his eye he saw the body slowly start to sit up. His fight-flight instinct immediately kicked in and he ran up the stairs as fast as he possibly could, but he was so clumsy trying to get up the stairs that he tripped and was pretty much crawling and clawing his way to the top. He was almost near the top of the stairs before his senses finally came back and he realized it was rigor mortis. He collected himself and started to laugh at how absurd it all was. He'd been doing this for 15 to 20 years at this point, and he had never had a freak out like that before where instinct overtook knowledge and experience. He also sheepishly admitted that he had to go clean himself after because he had shit his pants in the panic.
And I thought I'd finish off with a tale to lift your spirits just a little, even though some of you may find this one the most horrific of all. From Reddit user Sweet Oklahoma, we have the tale of the gas. It goes as follows. My best friend works in the death business. She tells me all sorts of lovely things about her job, but my favorite involves a gurney and some stairs. A family called in that their mother had passed in their apartment. 3rd story, narrow halls, no elevators. Anyway, she goes to pick up the body to take back to the funeral home with an assistant. So they get up there and lift this woman who is close to 300 pounds onto the gurney and begin their journey down to the van. Mind you, the whole family was there and pretty much in hysterics, crowding around as they make their way to the stairs. They make it about halfway down the first flight of stairs when the body starts to slide. There's no way to reposition, so my friend, who is at the foot of the gurney, is now about butt level to the freshly deceased. So trying to make the best of the situation, they continue their way down and try not to shift the body anymore. The thing about dead bodies is that gas starts to exit pretty quickly, and I'm sure you know where my story's going. The body started letting out farts straight into my friend's face with every step down they take, and this poor girl has to keep a straight face while getting crop dusted by a dead lady while her whole family is watching.
The curve is a turning intersection, a dangerous one where Route 222 meets State Route 125, and it's also said to be the most haunted place in all of Ohio. Although there have been many deaths at the intersection, the majority of hauntings are attributed to 5 young men who were killed there on October 19th of 1969 after their 1968 Impala was hit head-on by a 1969 Roadrunner going more than 100 miles an hour. Since then, the curve has been haunted by the deceased young men who appear as faceless hitchhikers hoping to catch a ride from someone who can take them away from the place where they met their grisly end.
Next we head to Rachel, Nevada with Route 375. This is a pretty notorious stretch of road, known for its supposed extraterrestrial activity. So much so that it's been nicknamed the Extraterrestrial Highway. UFO fanatics from all of the world flock here year after year, hoping to catch an unidentified object in the sky or hopefully find some clue as to what's really going on in Area 51. Driving along this road, you'll get closer to the place than you'd probably ever hope. Now, aside from Area 51 though, there are other interesting spots along the route. There are old atomic bomb sites, lots of other military facilities, and on top of all the alien stuff, there's said to be plenty of paranormal weirdness, vanishing apparitions along the road, phantom headlights, and for everyone with a clown phobia, you may want to make sure you plan your route so that you don't end up having to spend a night at the Clown Motel, which is exactly what it sounds like. A clown-themed motel filled with ceramic clown dolls, puppets, life-size statues, you name it. Definitely where I'd be wanting to spend the night, but maybe not for everybody.
Highway 5, located in Lynn, Alabama. It was what was once a normal highway became a hotbed for paranormal activity after a young woman was killed one night in the late 20th century. A young woman and her boyfriend had been making their way home from prom when the pair got into a vicious fight. Not being able to bear another moment spent arguing with her partner, the woman decided to exit the vehicle, and in a fit of anger, her boyfriend drove off, leaving her all alone in the middle of the night on an empty highway with no shelter, sidewalks, or anyone to help for miles around. She was determined though, and so she began walking along the highway in hopes of making it home by sunrise. Unfortunately, however, she was struck by a truck in a hit and run and left to spend the rest of the night dying a slow, painful death in a ditch next to the road. Her body was discovered the next morning, and her spirit has been there ever since. She's been seen walking along the highway aimlessly in the hopes of one day being able to finally make it back home to her family. Those who see her on the road and stop for help are greeted with a pretty creepy sight of a woman mangled and distressed who disappears when they finally get close enough to speak to her.
Route 2A in Maine is said to be one of the most haunted stretches of road in all of the US. Not only do you have loads of ghost stories, but it really is a pretty dangerous road. Lots of deadly accidents have happened here, especially in the winter, where the conditions are said to be absolutely brutal. Tons of sharp turns and blind corners, so it's a pretty notorious road as is. One of the most famous ghost stories is the Screaming Woman. A number of travelers driving along the road at night will report spotting a woman screaming by the side of the road, desperate for help, saying that her husband is trapped in a car wreck, so she asks to be driven further up the road where the accident is, but somewhere along the journey, the woman disappears. The story goes that one winter night, a newly married couple was driving along the road when they swerved and hit a utility pole. The husband was killed instantly, but the woman was thrown from the vehicle. She limped along the road for a while in search of help, but there were no other vehicles. Eventually, she collapsed and died from the cold.
Zombie Road, the most haunted road in Missouri, located in Willwood, Missouri, just west of St. Louis, if you know it. Today, Zombie Road is not so much a road as it is a series of trails, but at one point it was a road, and that is why it is on this list today. Zombie Road was originally constructed in the 19th century, but it was shut down in 2010 to be repurposed as a bike path. Big mistake. Prior to the road being converted into a trail, Zombie Road is rumored to have been home to a crazed killer who escaped from a nearby asylum during the 1950s. He lived out the rest of his days hiding in shacks around the road and preying on young men and women who were unfortunate enough to have been walking around the area. Eventually he died, but unfortunately, according to legend, that didn't stop his reign of terror, because it is believed that the crazed man went on to continue his killing spree in the afterlife, which is how the road came to be known as Zombie Road. When the road was converted to trails, it seems as though the spirit of the man, along with the spirits of his victims, became quite pissed off, because instances of paranormal activity in the area became so bad that city officials were forced to create strict hours of operation for the trail that forbid entry after dark. If you've been, let me know.
A name like Shades of Death Road doesn't really inspire a whole lot of confidence now, does it? At least not in your safety. This road in New Jersey is said to be one of the most haunted places in the entire state. Even before motorized vehicles were a thing, this place had a dark reputation. There were some very violent incidents that took place along here. In the 1920s and 30s, there were some pretty famous incidents. The creepiest, though, is probably the woman who lobbed off her husband's head and then buried both parts of his body on either side of the road. Just off the road is a pretty famous lake too, Ghost Lake, which gets its name for a pretty obvious reason. Spooky stuff happens there. Oh, and there's ghosts. Apparently there's often said to be an eerie fog surrounding the lake, and the sky is perpetually bright, even in the middle of the night, almost like it's always twilight.
What better name is there for a haunted road than Mount Misery? But wait, there's more, because Mount Misery is actually part of a set of two haunted highways, Mount Misery Road and Sweet Hollow Road, that neighbor one another and share in an incredibly ominous and haunted past. According to legend, a woman named Mary killed her husband and their daughters while driving down Mount Misery one night, and then, unable to live with what she had done, she took her own life while driving down Sweet Hollow Road. Many people who have driven down the roads at night have claimed to have seen a police officer flagging them down, as he would have done to Mary after she killed her family. Now, when these people get closer to the officer, they realize that the man is actually missing the back of his head. It's a gruesome sight, and at that point they drive away. Also, others claim that at one time the road was connected to the entrance of an insane asylum, which was burned to the ground one night by an angry patient, and that if you listen closely while driving down the road in the dead of night, you can still hear the dying patient's fiery screams. That sounds like hell.
And finally, we have Highway 299 in California. This one passes by a ghost town, so that, along with other ghostly tales, and it's no surprise why it's said to be one of the most haunted roads in the country. Highway 299 is a long, lonely road running from east to west through the state of California, known for its eerie ghost stories. The most haunted part is said to be between Old Shasta City and Whiskey Town Lake. Old Shasta City was, at one time, a lively gold rush town, but it's now abandoned. All that remains of it now are the ruins of the old bakery, the blacksmith shop, Mason's Lodge, and courthouse. Inside the courthouse, there is an old jail where it's said the spirits of criminals who were tried and hanged still lurk around. And further up the road is Whiskey Town. And Whiskey Town is super interesting because there's an entire town submerged under a lake. When the Whiskey Town Dam was built decades ago, the town flooded and its residents had to leave. But some believe that not everyone left, and the spirits of the people who once lived in the town now haunt the lake. And even if they're not haunting it, just swimming where there's an entire old abandoned town below you, that's weird.
We have the alternate phases of Highway 167. There are accounts of people driving on familiar roads only to find themselves in completely unfamiliar landscapes or towns that just should not exist along their route. One particular story involves Highway 167, where drivers reported entering foggy patches and emerging into surroundings that appeared to be from a different time period or just a completely different reality, only to return to their known world upon retracing their route. It's just so creepy. I feel like we've talked about like a few specific scenarios that kind of deal with the same thing before. Just is so unsettling. I don't know, there's just something weird about that. Next up, we have the man who woke up in a different marriage. This story is about a man who claimed to have woken up next to a woman he recognized, but in a life that wasn't his. He had memories of life with another woman, his actual wife, but in this new reality, he was married to an old girlfriend. His job was different, and even his car in the driveway was not the one that he remembered. Despite extensive searches, he found no evidence of his former life and began to question his sanity until he suddenly returned to his original world with everything back to normal. This does sound like an absolute nightmare, but it also, you know, sometimes people think like, what would have happened if like things went this way or whatever. So maybe it would be kind of cool to get like a glimpse. Okay, and finally today we have the non-existent hotel, back with another strange hotel experience. This one starts off with a businessman traveling in Europe in the 1970s who claims to have stayed at a beautiful old-fashioned hotel. Nothing wrong with that. Upon returning to the city years later, he was unable to find the hotel. In fact, there were actually no records or evidence that it ever even existed. He even checked his old receipts and documents, which all referenced the hotel, yet no one in the city had any memory of such a place. This led him to believe that he might have spent a night in a parallel dimension. Imagine, you went to this mystery hotel and later realized you were staying in room 1408. Could you imagine? Oh, I would think that my whole life was a lie after that.
And at our number 5 spot, we have the piles of gas masks. So famously, there's one specific room in one of the schools in Pripyat where the floor is filled with gas masks. Looters had come in and taken the small amounts of silver in the mask filters. The presence of gas masks is obviously not a good sign. Doesn't make for a very happy sight. Looks more like the apocalypse hit, which is probably what it felt like for the residents of the city that day, especially the youngsters. They must have been scared out of their minds. What's also odd is that these gas masks weren't used. You'd think they would have been. Apparently just a week before the incident, students were trained on how to use them in case of an emergency, but after the incident took place and everyone was being evacuated, people were instructed not to use the masks because the Communist Party leadership thought the use of them would cause people to panic. Basically, they wanted to save face and not blow the issue out of proportion. You know, the worst nuclear disaster in history. Next up, we have the Chernobyl exclusion zone sign. This sign is straightforward yet crucial. Placed at the boundaries of the zone, it's a worn out marker, weathered by time, warning anyone who approaches. The sign features the distinct trefoil radiation symbol, an unmistakable sign of the danger that lies beyond, marking the edge between safety and risk. The sign is surrounded by rusted gates and crumbling walls, signifying the transition from the familiar to the forbidden, signaling the presence of invisible threats from the nuclear catastrophe that took place back in '86. The exclusion zone sign is a tangible reminder that the invisible dangers of radiation are still very much present. It marks a boundary that, if crossed without caution, could lead to exposure to radioactive contaminants. It's a no-nonsense marker in a place where the consequences of nuclear disaster are still very real, but people jump over all the time, apparently, like graffiti and stuff inside the area. I wouldn't do it personally, but hey, live your lives. Next on the list are the Chernobyl Pripyat river boats. Eerie as hell. So these boats were once the lifeblood of Pripyat, but when the reactor went kaboom in '86, everything changed. The whole area got evacuated, leaving these boats stranded and forgotten. Rusted metal, broken windows, and a thick layer of dust. These boats haven't moved in decades, just sitting there like ghost ships on a stagnant river. Nature's creeping in, moss, weeds, and who knows what else. The radiation factor amps up the creepiness. These boats were exposed to the fallout, soaking it up like a sponge. No creaking of the boat against the dock, no hum of engines, just eerie stillness. Then there's the knowledge that Pripyat was a lively place once. Families lived there, kids played by the river. Now it's just a desolate wasteland. Number 2, the dolls. Within the deserted kindergarten of Pripyat, the floor is scattered with the haunting remnants of childhood abandoned dolls left behind by evacuated youngsters. Their lifeless eyes stare into the emptiness of a room that once echoed with laughter and play. The dolls, which are now weathered and disheveled, sit frozen in time. Some left in the exact same places where they were left in the middle of play all those years back. And what makes the presence of these dolls so somber is that the residents were told that the evacuation was going to be temporary. So in this abrupt evacuation, children left these toys behind thinking they'd be back soon to get them. But of course, as we all know, they never returned. One of the saddest displays is a set of 4 dolls positioned for a tea party, left sitting in place ever since that fateful day in '86. And we gotta finish things off with all the icky animal mutations. Now, this is actually true. This is not in the realm of cryptozoology. There have been animals found within the area that have some unusual mutations. You have rodents with peculiar physical deformities, ranging from extra limbs to abnormal growths. In some cases, the effects extend to changes in the color of their fur. Birds have also shown signs of the radiation's influence. Some have beak malformations, and even their mating practices have been shown to be off. And you can only imagine how messed up some of the fish are in the Pripyat River, fish have abnormalities like altered spinal structures and asymmetrical body growth because they're living in radioactive water. What's kind of interesting though is that, sure, there are a bunch of mutations, but the exclusion zone has kind of become a haven for some wildlife because there's no human interference, or at least very, very little. So some species have thrived in this absence of human activity. Nature is incredibly resilient.
The next story was submitted to Reddit by user NSL Lewis, and it's called "My Wife Has a Removable Face." It was their third date when Lewis leaned in to kiss Samantha. She stopped him and told him something he had never heard before, that she had a removable face. At first he assumed she was joking, but then she showed him the slight inconsistency at the bottom of her chin that proved that what she was saying was in fact true. She gave him the option to leave, but he stayed, and eventually the pair were engaged. Everything seemed normal except for the fact that once a day Samantha locked herself in the bathroom for an hour to clean her face. She would remove it and disinfect it, otherwise it would begin to smell and eventually rot. Lewis was never allowed to see her true face, nor was he allowed to know how the whole thing came to be. No one knew about Samantha's condition except for Lewis and his friend Chris, who he had drunkenly confessed the secret to one night on his bachelor's trip. Years later, after Lewis and Samantha had tied the knot, Chris came to visit them in their home. While Lewis was on a work call, Samantha went upstairs to freshen up, and that is when Chris's curiosity got the best of him. Using a paperclip, he unlocked the bathroom door where Samantha was cleaning her face, and then all of a sudden Lewis heard screaming. He ran upstairs to find Chris in hysterics, using the same paperclip he had used to get into the bathroom to repeatedly impale his eyes. While Samantha screamed, "He looked! Call the police! He looked!" Chris was taken into hospital, seizing and covered in bodily fluids. When the story was written, Chris had been admitted to the hospital, now completely blind and virtually unresponsive, save his frequent fits of violent paranoid mania. Samantha is distraught at what has happened to Chris, and Lewis is more curious than ever to see his wife's real face. For this next one, I thought I'd take the time to rattle off two-sentence horror stories I found while exploring the dark world of scary Reddit. The first story comes from Reddit user according_rise602, and it goes: "My mother called me and told me she was 20 minutes away and to shut and lock all the doors and windows. But I can see her and dad standing in the driveway with big smiles calling my name." The second two-sentence horror story was posted by user OK_relationship_4162. "Every night I hear my closet door open and heavy breathing, but I tell myself it's nothing and then go back to sleep. Tonight when I heard the door open, I closed my eyes, but when the breathing got louder, I opened them to see that whatever had been hiding in my closet was now standing over me with its jaw unhinged, revealing many layers of sharp teeth." This next story was posted to Reddit by user Grand Theft Motto. I will be calling him Motto, and it's called "Something Walks Whistling Past My House Every Night at 3:03. When Motto moved into a new neighborhood with his family, they were greeted by a welcoming committee who told them about how the neighborhood was extremely good to those who lived there, in that it brought them an immense amount of luck in the form of a million little blessings. Motto and his family had actually seen these blessings firsthand, as shortly after moving into the neighborhood, Nola, Motto's sister, was finally able to breathe on her first time without the use of an iron lung, and she started becoming healthy and growing normally after such a rocky start in life. While this was fantastic, the welcoming committee also had a warning for the family. Never look for the source of the whistles heard throughout the neighborhood from 3:03 to 3:05 a.m. Those who do experience tragedy and great misfortune, as well as having the life completely drained from their bodies. The family followed the rules to a T, with Motto's father even buying heavy-duty blinds that he locked each and every night to keep himself, his wife, Motto, and Nola from ever looking for the source of the whistling. All was well and the blessings were plenty until one night Motto had a friend, Holden, over to spend the night. He was new to the neighborhood and he didn't seem to take the whistling as seriously as everyone else did. Holden then managed to steal a key from Motto's father, and at 3:03, right as the whistling began, he went over to the blinds, unlocked them, and looked out the window. Motto shielded his and Nola's eyes while Holden screamed and closed the blinds. Motto's parents woke up and then joined the three downstairs right before the knocking started. Loud pounding on the front door, then the back, then the windows, then the walls, then all at once. And it only stopped when Holden yelled out, "I promise I won't tell them what I saw." Silence. And then just a small tapping on the window for the rest of the night. The next morning, Motto's father took Holden back to his house, and that day, Holden and his family left the neighborhood, their bodies moving somewhat limp and the life completely drained from their eyes. Okay, this next story was submitted to Reddit by user sufficient_moose67. It's a story that they were told when they were young, one that I have also heard when I was young, and it haunted my dreams for years. It's called Dogs Aren't the Only Ones Who Lick. Story goes that one day a woman living alone felt a lick on her hand. She looked down to see her dog standing next to her. A few days went by, again she felt a lick on her hand, but this time her dog was about a step away. Thinking that he had licked her hand and taken a step back, she thought nothing of it and went about her day. The next day, she felt a lick, but when she looked down, she didn't see her dog. In fact, the dog was standing at the other side of the room. The next day it happened again. This time, her dog was asleep in the room next to hers. A few days later, she felt another lick, but this time, her dog was nowhere to be found. She looked high and low around her home before finally checking the bathroom. The curtain was closed in the shower, and so she opened it to reveal the lifeless body of her dog and a message written in BLOOD that read, "Dogs aren't the only ones who lick." Next up, we have a story submitted by do-tomatillo5363 that I like to call Cleaner Together. It's pretty short, so here goes. I was taking a shower and decided to wash my hair. As I was washing it, some shampoo had gotten into my eyes. As I was using my hands to wipe the shampoo out of my eyes, I felt as though something was standing in front of me. I opened them quickly and I saw something. I closed them in panic, and when I opened them again, I didn't see anything. So I went back to rinsing out my eyes when all of a sudden I realized that something was still scrubbing the back of my head. I mean, as if closing your eyes in the shower wasn't already scary enough, now you have to worry about whatever the heck that thing was. Hell no. I'm so beyond over scary shower stories at this point, it's actually unreal. I'm changing all my shower curtains for doors and wearing goggles in the shower. Okay, it's getting pretty creepy up in here, so let's throw in another two-sentence horror stories for good measure. The first was submitted by Federal-Hornter01671, and it goes like this. I was tossing and turning all night because I felt like something was crawling over my skin. It wasn't until I went into the bathroom and looked into the mirror that I realized it was actually because something was crawling in it. Gross. Yeah, think about that. Think about bugs under your skin when you're going to sleep tonight. Next story comes from user Miami Metro, and it goes, growing up with cats and dogs, I got used to the sounds of scratching at my door while I slept. Now that I live alone, it's much more unsettling. Oh god, I feel like with that one, we're looking down the barrel of a Dogs Aren't the Only Ones Who Lick sequel called Cats Aren't the Only One Who Scratch. Big no from me. Let's move on. Next story comes from Reddit user It's a Miracle, who said that they used to sleepwalk when they were younger, often waking up outside in the middle of the night before making their way back into the darkened doorway of their home, where they had left the doors wide open as almost an invitation to whomever might be lurking around in the night. One night, however, they had a different experience. In their sleep, they had walked over to the window on the ground floor and drawn the curtains fully open, when all of a sudden they came to and were face to face with a large, completely hairless man inching closer and closer towards the window. Frozen in place, they let out a loud scream before emptying their bladder onto the floor. The man outside the window then screamed himself before running off into the night. When the user, It's a Miracle, told his mother what had happened, she thought it must have been a dream, until they went outside and they found a screwdriver on the front porch along with damage to the door jamb and door handle. Thank God for sleepwalking, I guess. And we're going to finish things off today with two more two-sentence horror stories because they creep me out, and I want you to think about these as you crawl into bed tonight. The first comes from user Just Another Muffled Vo and reads, as I began tucking him into bed, he tells me, "Daddy, check for monsters under my bed." I look underneath for his amusement, but to my horror, I see another him staring back at me, quivering as he whispers, "Daddy, there's something on my bed. And finally, for our last bedtime story, we have 2 sentences posted by Unbreakable Ned that read, "I lay shaking underneath my blanket, hiding from the monster, too afraid to move. All of a sudden, I heard him say, 'Blankets aren't weapon-proof,' before unzipping his bag." So yeah, if you were planning on hiding under your blanket because you're freaked out after this video, don't bother, it doesn't work. Thanks, Unbreakable Neb. You guys, I've been your host. I've had goosebumps this entire time because these stories freak me out. Hannah Thompson, see you next time.
Want to see more videos like this one? Check out this video next. It's about mysterious creatures that defy explanation. Scientists are working tirelessly to find out what these creatures are. Hopefully we can get more information as time goes, but watch the video for yourself to see these animals firsthand. What are you waiting for? Click the video now.